Hello and welcome back to the Faith and Culture Show. I'm Catherine Camp, your hostess for this show. And this is where we learn about things in order to engage our culture with conversations that count. Conversations with an eternal perspective. Today, we're going to touch on a really different type of topic than we usually talk about. But that's because I have an expert in the house today. We're going to talk about this argument over, is the earth flat or is it a sphere? First of all, I want to mention this is not, and I repeat, this is not a salvation issue. So none of us should be fighting over it or accusing one another of not being true to the faith. So I'm real excited to bring on an astrophysicist, and you may have already heard of him. His name is Dr. Jeff Zweerink. He is a senior research scholar for Reasons to Believe. His work focuses on helping people of all backgrounds to bridge the perceived gap between science and the Christian faith. And I've actually met people who do not believe that science and faith go together. And I believe that's because it's been built in intentionally into our culture as far back as the 1800s. Now, Reasons to Believe, if you've never heard about it, is an organization that is dedicated to demonstrating the compatibility of science and the Christian faith. Now, Jeff writes and speaks on the compatibility of science and the faith and on evidence for intentional design from a multiverse theory, dark energy and dark matter, and exoplanets. That is way over my head. I love science. I'm a little bit better at the biology, and that's why I wanted to bring Dr. Zweerink in, because I want to learn right alongside with you. Now, his speaking engagements take him to universities, churches, and other venues around the world, including high schools and youth groups and numerous conference proceedings. He is also the author of Is There Life Out There? And Who's Afraid of the Multiverse? And Escaping the Beginning. Welcome, Dr. Zweerink. I'm still learning your name.
That is fine. No, I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
Thank you for being here. Like I said, I am not an astrophysicist. I'm not a scientist, even though I'm kind of a shade tree scientist when it comes to biology. And I do enjoy it. And I think it's important for all of us to understand at least the basics of how we were made, how we were created. But the cosmos is something completely different. And this has been your lifelong career. And so if you want to fill in some gaps that I didn't touch on in the introduction, that would be great. And that way the audience could get to know you a little bit better. And then let's get into where this argument even started about a flat earth versus a spherical earth.
Well, thanks, Catherine. Yeah, I have been I kind of say I've been a scientist all my life, because a scientist looks and says, how do things work the way they do? And then goes about trying to understand and figuring out explanations, not just coming up with ideas in your head, but actually testing and see, do they actually explain what's going on? And so I've been fascinated with the way the universe works. I got a physics degree at Iowa State University, saw that science and faith seem to intersect a little bit more in the astronomy realm. So I got a PhD in astrophysics, got to study things that are called very high energy gamma rays. These are electromagnetic radiation that, if you look at the light coming from the light bulbs, has an energy on the order of 10. If you go to the doctor, get an x-ray, that has an energy of about 10,000. If you're the Incredible Hulk, you're exposed to light that had an energy of about 1 million, but the stuff I got to look at had energies of 1 trillion. And so these are just gamma or messengers, light coming from some of the most exotic and violent places in the universe. And so just got to study, how do we detect them? What does it tell us about what's going on? Since I've kind of moved into another area of high energy astrophysics, where we're flying a balloon experiment to figure out whether we can find dark matter remnants over the over the South Pole and Antarctica. So it just kind of fun stuff, figuring out how does our universe work and what does it tell us about who we are, who God is, and how do we relate to it.
Well, that's a real big deal because we have, like I said in the beginning, we have a culture now that doesn't feel like science and faith go together. I believe that you can't really know science until you know God, because you limit yourself to a certain set of understandings and it's in a box, instead of really looking at what's out there in the perfection, both in the cosmos and at the cellular level with biology and inside of every living creation on this planet. So you've gotten to see a lot of things out there, different light waves, like you say. I don't understand it. I'd like to. So where do you think we should start with this flat Earth versus the round Earth?
Well, I think one of the things that I find fascinating about this whole flat Earth, spherical Earth argument, if you want to say, and I don't even really want to call it an argument, because that makes it sound like there are two reasonable sides to this, is that, you look at the history and a lot of people want to think, oh, people have been arguing about whether the Earth is flat or round for centuries. Well, the reality of it is that, particularly in Western society, and even especially within the Christian culture, Christians have largely argued that the Earth was spherical for thousands of years. But you go back to at least 250 BC, and you've got Eratosthenes actually measuring the circumference of the Earth. And so the idea that there's been this long debate of whether the Earth is flat or spherical, and whether Columbus was worried that he was going to sail off the edge of the Earth, it's all really, I kind of hate to say this, but it's almost kind of manufactured controversy, because it's just not the reality of what scholars have thought, let alone even probably most of the general population have thought. So it's really kind of an odd phenomena, because, like I said, for the last 2,000 years, Western society has largely accepted the idea that the universe or the Earth is a sphere. And so it really hasn't become a controversial topic until more recently, largely to fuel that. I think you can make a pretty strong argument to fuel the idea that science and Christianity are in conflict with one another.
I was going to ask you, what do you think is the big deal? I think the very first time I even heard about it was, I guess it was 2017. And one of my college students asked me if I believed in the flat Earth. And I thought, okay. He also asked me if I believed in the Illuminati. And I was like, I don't understand any of what you're saying. It was all new to me. And so I then I started hearing more and more, like you say, for me, it's recent. And now it seems to be everywhere. Mm-hmm. I've seen diagrams that have been drawn up, put in animation to give an explanation for why people think this. Personally, as just a lay person, looking out at the planets through a telescope or going to a planetarium and seeing things that we can't see with the naked eye, we can see a little further. Everything else is round, spherical. Why do people say this? Do you have any background how they've come to these conclusions?
I don't have a general, here's what everybody thinks. I know at least among the classes of people I have run across or seen, I think there's one group of people that wants to discredit Christianity. So they want to make an argument that, the Bible and Christians have always thought the Earth was flat. That's why Galileo got in trouble, is because he was arguing against science, and that's why he got in trouble. And so this conflict thesis actually dates to the late 1800s, early 1900s. And in spite of research I can show you where historians of scientists will go in and say, this idea is at best incomplete or an overstatement, and at worst it's a deception. So it's really not a academically credible way to look at things, this conflict thesis. Nonetheless, it still seems to pervade a lot of common or popular culture out there. And so I think there is one group of people who just want to make it sound like, hey, the church is backwards. It's always got these backwards beliefs. It thinks the earth is flat. We clearly know that's wrong. And so the more they can paint Christians as thinking that, it gives them a tool to marginalize what Christians have to say. And the reality of it is, again, I can't emphasize this strongly enough. There's just no truth to that narrative. There are Christians who have been flat earth, but the Christian scholarship out there over the last 2 millennia has largely said Christians have agreed that the earth is spherical. So part of at least one class just wants to make Christianity look bad, but that's not the only class of people out there.
Okay. For some reason, I felt, and like I said, I don't know anything about this, and that's why I've asked for you to be here. But who came up with all of these fancy drawings? And someone took a lot of time, or groups of people. Maybe this is something that grew over time, and very complicated, very complex ideas of how the world or our sphere works, not flat like a pizza, I guess. And you have, it almost looks like gears underneath us. Mm-hmm. And I don't understand. Do you know, is it just Christians who came up with that, or did someone in the secular realm throw that out there? I don't know where it comes from.
Yeah, it's a mix of both. And I think you can trace at least the modern flat earth type ideas back to the middle of the 1800s. And I'm not entirely sure, I don't know that there was ever research that clearly articulates what the motivation of this fellow, but a guy named Samuel Rowbotham, Rowbotham, made an argument that there's a better way to look at things. He published this text called Zetetic Astronomy, which I don't want to go into the philosophy of it, but it's kind of a way of thinking that emphasizes inquiry and ongoing questioning and what you can see with your physical senses, what you can see, not so much building on prior knowledge that other people have built. And so he was interested, for whatever reason, in this idea of whether the earth was flat or not. And there was this interesting experiment he could do. I want to say it's over in Scotland, but I'm pretty sure it's over in the UK, where there's this very long canal which has very low flow to it, and so the water should be level all along in there. It's not like it's going downhill or anything, and it's about 20 miles long. And so he did some experiments to say, hey, let's take and measure and see, what's the distance above the water, how far can you see things as they move away, because if the earth is curved in the way everybody said, then after about a mile, it should be eight inches lower. And, you can make these calculations. And at least some of his earlier experiments seem to show that the elevations didn't change. And so that idea kind of got popularized a few years later. And that kind of seems to be the genesis of when all of the flat earth stuff that we're talking about today comes about. In the meantime, you had a lot of different people, some Christians, some not, who've articulated ideas about how it could be. And, there's some that say the earth is flat. I think with Samuel Rowbotham's ideas, the earth was a disk. The sun and moon were about 3,000 miles up, and the heavens were about 3,100 miles up. And so he had this kind of elaborate mechanism. But all of these people seem to want to explain, why does it all work the way it does? And so that's where you get all these sophisticated and complex pictures of what's going on there. And that to me, I think, is one of the tools at least a reasonable person can go in and look and say, all right, there are these two models out there. One's this kind of flat earth model. Choose your particular flat earth model. There's the standard scientific model, and say which one actually explains all of the data the best. Sorry, I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now? Okay. I said, let me repeat. I said that does make sense as to why these different models have come up and how people would have started putting these together, because it's obvious someone took a long time. I think people started building on the different ideas. So someone like yourself who has studied this universe deeply, how do we help people to see what science is showing, as opposed to what are the problems with this other theory versus what does science show us? I know that's a huge question. So you just go at it any way you feel necessary.
It is really a complicated question. And I think part of what complicates the answer to it is that I'm not so sure that more scientific evidence is the way to go about it in dealing with any individual person. So the thing that I would actually say is, rather than try and here's all the arguments that I want to help you understand, is really just kind of explore, why is it that the flat earth is attractive? What makes you, what draws you to that model of the way of looking things? And one of the things that I have found, and granted, it's a more limited, handful of people. I haven't talked to a lot of people who are willing enough to engage me and talk and kind of share why they believe it's a flat earth. But one of the things that I have found is that it seems to me one of the common themes is that these are people who've had their trust violated in a very fundamental way. Because, and part of why I think that's important is that if I were to ask myself, what would I have to do to believe that the earth is flat? One, I would have to believe that virtually all of the scientific data I have been taught to date is incorrect.
Okay.
Because we can measure how far away the moon is. We can see different parts of the moon. We see that the moon is it doesn't rotate around us. We kind of see one face, but it does kind of wobble. So we can actually see about 59% of it. We can see the sun. We see all the different sides of the sun. It looks like a sphere. The moon looks like a sphere. All the objects in our solar system that are large enough look like spheres. The earth should be a sphere. The rotation of the earth on its axis explains why we have days and nights. The tilt of the earth on its axis as it revolves around the sun explains why we have seasons. That gravity explains a whole slew of how the cosmos, there's so many things that just make good sense if the earth is spherical. And so I'd have to say all of that's wrong. Now it might be. I mean, I will be, just to be incredibly generous, I say, well, that may be, but there's a lot of evidence pointing towards that. But I would also have to say the bigger part that I think is harder to get at is that we have people who've been to the moon and taken pictures of the earth from the moon, and it has a spherical shape to it. And so every bit of space travel and anything we do with satellites, all of that has to be a conspiracy. The level of the number of people involved in that and making that conspiracy work it just boggles my imagination to think that could actually work. And I know people who are involved, my spiritual mentors, who are involved in this program, the space program, and trying to figure out how do we communicate with different satellites and understanding how the earth orbits. And these are people not just who kind of doing the day-to-day grunt work, but who are organizing the programs and figuring out how we do this. These are people who are my spiritual advisors, have to be in on the conspiracy. And yet they've shown themselves to be good, wise, spiritual Christian guides. And so there's just a lot of things that I would have to say, you kind of almost have to have a little bit of conspiratorial mindset to even get into that camp and think it's reasonable.
Okay. I'm sure you've heard this, but they're the same people that believe in a flat pizza-shaped earth also don't believe that people actually went to the moon.
That's correct.
It is. It's the same people.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, it would have to be a massive cover-up.
Mm-hmm.
Somehow. There was that movie back, I guess it was in the 80s. What was it called? I think
it was The Truman Show. Was that the one? Or
not that one, but I know that one. No, this one was one where they showed how the moon landing was faked.
I'm drawing a blank on the name, but I have heard of the movie you're talking about.
Okay. All right. So, they believe that all of that was staged. Mm-hmm. And some of the arguments they come up with are kind of valid, like the space buggy. How did it get there? Because it was quite large compared to the unit that actually landed on the moon. All of this, I'm just saying this because I know people that are going to watch this once I name it Flat Earth versus Spherical Earth.
Mhm.
I want to, give people some food for thought. Like, okay, I'm glad you mentioned that your spiritual mentors are doing grunt work, talking to satellites that are around the world or being launched around the world. And you have to have coordinates that are more than just from a flat perspective. So what else can you think of? I'm also thinking, like you mentioned, the way we tilt, the way we circle around the sun, and the way the moon, circles around us. It creates, our not our currents, the tidal currents. We do know that their gravitational pulls are. These are the same people that also say there's no gravity isn't for real. Now, I'm not sure how things are explained there either. Do you have an idea of how they're blowing off the idea of gravity?
Well, I've heard different things. So it's not, to my understanding, not all people who are flat Earth think the same mechanism at play. So there was an hour-long program I did on a different podcast called The Fallen State, where I was talking with a flat Earth person who his argument was that the sky is all just a big projection. And so the Earth is there's kind of a dome over it, and there's this big projector up there. And so what we see is the sun and the moon and all the other stars out there, they're just projections. And so there is nothing out there to speak of. And so the whole space program is a myth. And the general, I think a general idea is that you've got the Earth, the North Pole is the center, you've got all the continents, the south, what we would call the South Pole or Antarctica, is a big wall of ice around the edge, and whether there's a dome that goes over it, how it seems to vary from there. But in that model where it's just a big dome, then all of the space program and everything like that's just projections that we put up there that we can study. So somebody's controlling all that and running all that to show us what we need to see. Again, whether you find that believable or not, it's a different thing. I know other people who said, okay, yeah, gravity doesn't exist, we're accelerating through. I mean, you kind of have to look at each person. How do they explain it to be able to delve into that? Because as I understand it, there's not here's a general flat Earth model and here's how it all works. It's going to vary kind of almost maybe person to person.
Okay. All right. So you actually were on a show with someone with a flat earther. And can you tell us the name of the podcast so people can go there and check that out? So, because you have the two of you, I presume, going back and forth, and you're giving your scientific understandings, and this other person's giving their understanding. Where can people go to see that?
The name of the podcast was called The Fallen State, with the guy's first name's Jesse. I forget his last name. And the person I was talking with was a guy named Mark Sargent, who at the time was a fairly prominent person in the young Earth community, or the flat Earth community, not young Earth community.
Okay. Well, these are good. I mean, I think if we're going to believe in something, in a way, it's kind of a series. It could end up being a theological issue if you start looking at, okay, why did God create this planet differently? And if it's just a dome, who is powerful enough to cause one season on this part of the earth and another season on another part of the earth? In Australia, it's starting to be their winter season. They're getting into fall. Here, we're going in North America, we are going into summer. So how does that even happen when you've got some grand puppeteer? And who is that grand puppeteer? That's the theology that I would be a little concerned about, is someone's view on God through all of this, even though I did state in the beginning, this is not a salvation issue. Maybe I just convinced myself it could be, depending on how far people want to take it.
Well, you raise a very good point. How you think about this does lead to implications of how you think about God. And I think you can be an old Earth creationist, a young Earth creationist, and think well about God. I think you might be able to be a flat earther or a sphere earther, and so. But I think whatever we want to do, we want to make sure we're thinking rightly about God. And one place where I would wonder how a flat Earth person would think about this is that part of what I see of the majesty and God's splendor is, you talk about the reliability of how God upholds creation, that everything exists because his hand upholds it, that if you were to withdraw his hand, it would tumble into non-existence. This is, the typical or the historic Orthodox Christian view of how Christians think about God's interaction with creation. Part of how that plays out and how it's developed scientifically is that when Isaac Newton was looking out at the cosmos, and Copernicus even at the time, what he recognized is that there were kind of, the thought of the day was there were the way things operated on the heaven or on Earth, and then the heavens behaved differently. And what Copernicus and ultimately Newton recognized is that, wait a second, the same physics that plays out here on Earth is what's going on out in the heavens. So the reason an apple falls to the Earth, that's the same reason why the moon orbits around the Earth, is both of them are caused by the gravitational pull of the Earth. And that's why the Earth orbits around the sun and why the sun orbits around our galaxy. So there's the same laws of physics at operation throughout the universe, which allows us to now go out and explore the universe and understand it in a way that was previously impossible, because all we could do is look and say, wow, that's pretty, here's how it moves on the sky. But now we actually have a mechanism to explain why things work the way they do. And that's ultimately tied to how God upholds creation. And so from looking at it from the quote unquote standard scientific perspective, there's this very powerful argument that God is trustworthy, reliable in upholding creation. In his immutable nature we see that reflected in how creation is behaving. And so I think there's a very powerful argument that the God of the Bible is behind it all. And you get that because of what we know scientifically.
Okay. And you already kind of touched on it, but I wanted to ask you straight out, is there a dome over us that locks us in like a big biosphere here? That's what comes to my mind, is a biosphere, because out in New Mexico, they have some biospheres that they have built. But is the whole planet a giant biosphere? And I've seen how they show rockets, going up to a certain point, and then all of a sudden they lose steam, and it's almost like they hit something and then come down, or they start going sideways when people send these rockets up. Now, as an astrophysicist, have you heard that argument, and how do you get past that one?
Well, I've heard various things related to that, but all of that makes, I've not heard the argument where it goes up, it hits, and it comes back down, except I know there are times where we'll launch rockets to see if we can get it up there, and then they come back. It's all planned in the way we're doing it. But if you understand what a rocket is doing, the fact that it goes up and starts going sideways makes perfect sense, because almost every rocket we're launching is designed to put something in orbit around the Earth. Well, if you do that, you want to get up to space, and then you want to start putting things in orbit. And so, you watch the movie Hidden Figures. There was a big challenge of how do you get from the parabolic trajectory to the elliptical trajectory that you need to orbit the Earth. That was a tough thing to do, tough thing to develop the math for. But that's exactly what we want to do. We want to go up to up to space and then put things in orbit around. And what's fascinating is that you can actually go out and see, set your telescope up in your backyard. You can actually take images of the satellites that are up there. When we launched the space shuttle, without a lot of particularly fancy equipment, you could take pictures of the space shuttle with its bay doors open, pointing back towards the Earth. So this wasn't something that you had to be some experienced rocket scientist to do. Your average backyard astronomer could take their telescope and take these images. What was interesting, as I was having a conversation with a flat earther a flat earth person, and I was asking him, if you want some evidence, go out and look. There are times where you can look up and see these satellites. You can take pictures of them yourself. There's ones that are out tens of thousands of miles away. There's ones that are hundreds of miles away. Take your pick and go take pictures of them. And his response was, oh, that's NASA putting up weather balloons to confuse us. They're decoys, And again, so if there's a dome up there, there is this incredibly elaborate conspiracy so that whoever wants to go up and look at something, there's always some suitable decoy that's what they're seeing, instead of actually seeing the orderly traversing of satellites in their orbits around the Earth. It's an incredibly elaborate conspiracy that I find very hard to make work, because of how elaborate it has to be and how many people have to be involved with it.
Well, everyone would have to be involved that is a scientist, or rocket scientist, astrophysicist, because I've seen your work on the multiverse, and you can't really have that if this is the only planet out there that's flat. And of course, I guess they're believing that, like you said, it's a big projector, or some believe that somehow.
Yeah, there are some that believe that, yeah.
Okay, that the things we're seeing. Okay.
So there are other flat Earth people who would argue that, yeah, the heavens are out there, that it's not a big dome. It's just that our Earth is flat for whatever reason. So like I said, that's why it's important not to say, here's my argument, I want you to understand this. Is I think if you're going to interact with a flat Earth person, understand what they're actually saying first, so that you're interacting with what they believe, not what somebody else might believe that they wouldn't be arguing for.
Well, that sounds like apologetics. That sounds like just what we're trained to do is ask, why do you believe that? Right. And then you can get at that nitty gritty core of what's going on in their mind. Okay, you mentioned that the purpose of this could possibly be to make Christians look ridiculous, that they still believe in a flat Earth. But there are Christians who believe this, only because the arguments are so strong. And I'm wondering what would drive someone to that. Now, I don't know if you mentioned Antarctica and a big wall of ice. And I've heard some people say that that's the end edge. And behind that, there's a whole different civilization that no one is supposed to know about.
Right.
What do you know about that? I mean, you have participated in, literally, you've probably seen all the different aspects of our Earth. Can you put your 2 cents in there?
It is just an interesting phenomena, again, how people get there. I know that there are people who are Christians who would argue that the Earth is flat. There are people who are not Christians who would argue that the Earth is flat. So it's not a Christian versus scientist type thing. Because again, I mean, you look at just the abundance of the data out there, and most of the research shows that most Christian scholars have believed that the Earth was spherical. So that's, and they have so for hundreds of years. It's not just a recent thing. That's just what has been believed out there. So again, I think you can trace this newer idea of believing that the Earth is flat to this conflict thesis. And I think there are people who really do want to foment the idea that there's a conflict between science and Christianity for any numbers of reasons. But they talk about how, I mean, there have been times where the stances Christians have taken have been counter to the prevailing scientific idea at the time. But that's, again, you look at the history of science literature, and those are kind of more exceptions or part of a far more harmonious and more complex relationship. So again, I want to just re-emphasize that this idea of this conflict thesis is a thoroughly discredited idea in the history of science.
Well,
I'm
sorry, go ahead. No.
I just say when it comes down to it, I don't know why somebody would want to believe that. I do know that if you get to a place where you feel like you just can't trust anything, then you are susceptible to flat earth reasoning, because the idea is we're going to measure what we can measure. It doesn't matter that other people have measured it. It only matters what you can measure. And it kind of plays in. I mean, I tend to have a little bit of conspiratorial mindset, if I'm honest, and I have to work hard to not let that drive the conclusions I come to. But I can see myself, if I started, I could see a pathway where I would get there, but it requires no longer trusting a lot of the things that I do think are trustworthy now. And I think that probably is a common theme amongst a lot of people who believe in a flat earth. They tend to have a distrust of most or a lot of things that are going on out there. And I don't think that's a particularly controversial statement. Although if you're a flat earther and don't think that, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts and kind of see how to make sure I can formulate that more articulately.
I know. So if you are in that category that Jeff just mentioned, please make some comments and I'll send them right on to him, and we can continue searching for this. Unfortunately, I see, yes, I think a lot of people have become very distrustful of authority, or what we've always looked at as authority, and rightly so in many categories. Rightly so. Mm-hmm. The problem is it's by design to cause us to not trust. I was reading in the beginning of all of this, I was reading Revolution and State, Vladimir Lenin's book, Revolution and State, how to break down a society to make it a tyrannical, I guess, a dictatorship, basically, and Marxist understanding. So they want to break down any trust in any kind of authority that's been in a community or in a civilization, so that the people that are doing this can swoop in and say, well, we can put order back in place for you. Then it's under their rule. So that's just a Marxist kind of I guess the way of doing things. So yeah, I can understand. And that's, we ran into a lot of that. It started with the science of the earth, right? The flat and the round with the Galileo. Frankly, I think that was a bit of an embarrassment for Christianity. And I felt like we had moved on and started to look at, okay, this Galileo had made some sense here. Let's look at this closer. This is what we should do. And to have this come back around after all this time is interesting. And you gave me a different way to see this. And maybe it is a way to, dissect and make it more difficult for Christians to get along. Another reason to argue, benches and carpets aren't enough. And music up on stage. No, we have to get into all this now.
Well, and if I could, there is this in that conflict thesis. There's this idea that Galileo was looking at the world and he came up with scientific ideas, and the church wanted to maintain their authority, and so they squashed him. And you go look at the history, the history of all that affair, and it's just that's not the way it played out. The church was not resistant to Galileo's scientific ideas. There was a context in which all that happened. It was in the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter Reformation. It was talking about who had the authority to interpret Scripture. Did the layman, or did only the ecclesia, or did the cleric, or I'm drawing a blank. The clerical people, did they have to do that? And so people want to make that as, ooh, Galileo was the scientist and the church was oppressing. that's not what happened. And the scholarship shows that's not what happened. But yet that idea is out there. The church, you read Cardinal Bellarmine, who was involved in that. He was saying, your scholarship, your ideas may be right. That's not what we're talking about here. And so, again, the whole idea of this wanting to portray a conflict between science and Christianity, I don't think is coincidental. I don't know that I'm not saying everybody who's a flat earth person wants to foster conflict and dissension, but we can't underestimate that there are people who want to make it seem like there's a conflict between science and Christianity. And again, I just emphasize the abundance of research shows that that's not the proper way to look at it. That's the church and science have had a far more harmonious and complex relationship than any sort of conflict thesis would have. And in fact, you can make a really strong argument that the reason why the scientific enterprise was because of the Judeo-Christian worldview. So to claim that they're in conflict with one another stretches credulity in a lot of ways.
I've always found science incredibly exciting because the Bible just backs it up. Everything that we find out scientifically, oh, look, it was already in Scripture. We just didn't understand fully what it was talking about, but now we can see it even better, knowing newer and newer technology. So I've always found it very exciting, but that's because I hold to a biblical worldview. And so what I see is going to be backed by that. And I know that you can back what you see up with Scripture, which is very exciting. There's lots of order. It's not chaotic like we are told in school, that everything was just chaotic and you get order out of chaos. No, even in chaos theory, you don't get order out of chaos. Okay.
Well, to your point, it's remarkable the number of things that are said in Scripture. You just take Genesis, that this was authored in the time of Moses, whether Moses was the sole author or edited and compiled really doesn't change this point. But the author or, whoever is compiling and writing down Genesis, when you look at who they were talking to, here are the Israelites, they're coming out of Egypt, a culture that is steeped in pagan worship. You look at how the Israelites behave for centuries after that, and they're just steeped in pagan worship. Even though they're focusing on the God of, the Judeo-Christian God, at times they're just steeped in pagan thought. And so Moses is writing to this culture steeped in pagan thought. And when you look at how Genesis reads, it sounds, we think, more like Moses than his original audience did. That was how effectively Moses contextualized the truth of what God was revealing there. That we think more like Moses than his audience did. That's how transformative Judeo-Christian thought has been, that we think about things being orderly and regular, and what happens today affects what happens tomorrow, but what happens today does not affect what happened in the past. And there's a regularity to things, and there's a design, and there's a purpose, and there's a beginning, and humans were created. These are things that are not scientifically controversial statements. This is, in fact, the kind of world you need to live in for science to actually thrive and flourish.
Well, to even have knowledge with chaos, and if things are changing constantly, what we knew today is going to be different tomorrow. Therefore, there's no knowledge, and that would throw everything off. We couldn't learn anything. We couldn't formulate ideas that actually comport to reality, and that's kind of what I see that too. With postmodernism, we're not supposed to look at the past and how it affects the future or now, and unless it's something not healthy in the social sphere. And okay.
Your worldview really does matter. My colleague Ken Samples has written a lot on worldviews and how do you test worldviews and how do you measure the utility and the truthfulness of the Christian worldview. He might be someone you would enjoy talking to because he's done a lot of work on that and very articulate in how he says that. But just what you're saying, do you take a Judeo-Christian worldview or a postmodern worldview? It has radically different consequences for how we approach the world and what do we know and what we don't know.
Yes, yes, it does. And any field, no matter what field you're in, and frankly, I would rather, people who are molecular biologists or in your astrophysicist world, you have a broader perspective. You see things completely differently than someone with a limited naturalist worldview, and they can't explain a lot of what they see. They just can't. So that's why
they at least have to take it as a given. I mean, given Christianity, I would expect the world to be orderly and regular so that I can make measurements that what I measure today is the same as what it was yesterday and is the same as what it is tomorrow. Now, the naturalist can come along, and I think that's a testament to how well developed the scientific enterprise is, that you don't have to be a Christian to use science, to practice the science, and to engage in the scientific enterprise. But you are saying the world behaves the way Christianity describes it when you do science.
Exactly. So true. Okay. My another question I had was, where are some of the places that we see God's hand in the earth and universe that we've been given? There's a lot to put in there, unpack, but maybe give us some highlights. Where do we see God's hand in our universe for those people who have not seen your work before, or other creationists, scientific organizations? And I have to interject here that I am so happy to know that you all are out there doing this awesome work, bringing this information, knowledge, intellect into the discussion. I think when I first heard Fazell Reyna speak way back in 2013, I was like, finally, somebody who sees things the way they are. And he is just such a professional, and the way he put it out there, it just made so much sense. So anyway, I just had to say that because it does get me excited. When you all are at the National Conference on Christian Apologetics, I do enjoy stopping by and just hearing conversations, and I get my little questions in every now and then on a one-to-one, which is fun for me anyway. It's kind of geeky, but anyway. So where do we see the hand of God that most people may not be seeing in this universe?
I think there are a number of different ways. I think, kind of maybe from, I don't know, no particular order here, but I see that when you look at how the Bible describes creation, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, that there's a beginning to the universe, that there's a darkness. You look at this early earth, the darkness was over the earth, and the earth was formless and void. Darkness is over the surface of the deep. The Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. That there's this orderly progression of God making it formful and filled, and then filling it with creation, and ultimately creating humanity. That we see as we do our scientific studies, that description given in the Bible lines up with what we see scientifically, that there's a beginning to the universe, that the early earth on the surface was dark and formless and uninhabitable, covered in water, and it's transformed over processes over a long period of time, and ultimately humanity comes into being looking like a creation event, just like the creation of the universe. So the Bible describes the way the Bible describes the universe. We see that when we investigate it and go look at the physical creation. But I also think when you just ask, what kind of world do you need to have for science to be true? It's got to be an orderly universe. It's got to be a universe with regular periodic things. It's got to be a universe where our minds can understand what's going on. So it's got to be intelligible, and our minds have to be able to comprehend it. The universe needs to be objective. It's in that it's not just what everybody thinks. It needs to not be divine, so that you can study it and put it in the microscope as opposed to worshiping it. You ask what worldview does all of that? Well, it's the Judeo-Christian worldview. When you ask the question, what kind of place do we need for humans to live? You see that you need a planet that has around a certain kind of star that's not a first generation or second generation star, but a third generation star, so that it's got the heavier elements that we need. It's got to have enough carbon and oxygen, which requires the physics of the universe behaving a certain way. It's got to be far enough from the sun that it's not incinerated, but not so far that it's an ice ball. You got to have the right kind of atmosphere, and that atmosphere has to change over time as the sun gets brighter and as new life comes in, as continents are formed. You just see this intricate and elaborate design that is necessary for humanity to be here. And one of the things that I find truly fascinating, in my scientific research, I do quite a bit of computer programming. I just like it. It's fun to do. Part of what I like about it is that if it's ever not working, I know whose fault it is. It's mine. I didn't do things the way it was supposed to.
Yeah.
But you go look at the DNA, the genetic code that is the basis of all humanity, and you take the best computer code that humans have ever produced, and it pales in comparison to the genetic code. It is just phenomenal the way the genetic code can handle errors and still work properly, how it can have multiple layers of code on it, how it reproduces itself. It's just incredible. I mean, all of these places, you see the worldview you need, you see the Bible describes creation well, you see design littered throughout creation. It's just everywhere you look, you see evidence of design. That all points to a creator who's created it all, not just because he created, but because he created it because he wants us to know him. And so there's this personal nature that we see by studying creation and seeing the design things that are designed for a purpose. One of those that predominant purpose is so that we as humans can know God. And so we see that just abundantly evident as the more we know about science, the more we know about this universe, the more we see evidence for God and his desire for us to be in right relationship.
And like you say, there's intellect behind it.
Mm-hmm.
If anyone like yourself has, and I love coding. And so that's one of my things as well. When I was given the opportunity, I don't have time anymore, but you have to know logic, and it's very logical. If then that, if not, then over here. So it is, and chaos doesn't work that way. Randomness does not work that way. I love some of the things that you all have put together that actually, just shows people right in their face, think about it this way. So there's intellect. I really think what you said, it has to be objective. It's objective truth. It's not, okay, because I don't think that the world is let's just say a sphere, I'm going to see things just in one way, and that's my way, and I'm not going to look at anything else, because we have to have all that information. Go ahead.
No, exactly. And that's one of the things I love about the scientific method, is that there's this great equalizing role that it plays. Yes, it's done by people, and so people are people. Scientists are no better people than any other people. They have the same character flaws of everybody else. But one thing science does say is that ultimately what we're interested in is the ideas that best explain the data that's out there. And so I can come up with a idea that says, hey, this is the way it is. And I can get a bunch of people that say, yeah, Jeff's right. He's got the right idea. But if it doesn't explain the world, and it doesn't not only explain what we see, but kind of guide how we dig deeper into what we see and explain that well, then it's just a wrong idea. And it's not anything personal against me. I just had a wrong idea. So it allows us to discern what's true and what's incorrect. And it also means that science isn't done by majority vote or popularity.
Yeah.
So again, scientists are people, so it does play that way sometimes, but over long enough time scales, the best ideas win, and it doesn't matter who came up with the best ideas. The person who puts forth, anybody can come and play at the game, come to the table and contribute to the scientific enterprise. Put your ideas out there, let's test them. If they're wrong, either reject them, try a different way, modify them, and let's keep moving forward so that we understand more and more and build this body of truth that we can now say we're pretty confident this is right because there's this body of evidence behind it, which incidentally is exactly why we think Christianity is right. Not because we just want it to be true, but because there's this abundance of evidence that God created the universe, that Jesus was God's son. He was the second person of the Godhead, took on human flesh, that he lived on earth, died for our sins, resurrected so that he could atone for our sins and allow us to be restored to right relationship with God. These things are not just ideas that somebody came up with. They line up with the evidence that's out there.
Beautifully said. Are there any last, I could ask you so many more things, many questions, but we're almost out of time. So are there any last words that you'd like to leave with people? Tell us where people can find you and maybe what you're working on right now, and just words of wisdom to help people who may have a friend or relative who's really struggling with all of this and has made it a theological issue with the flat earth thing.
Yeah, that's a great question. The one thing I would say, and I would encourage anybody who's interacting with someone who has a difference of opinion, a piece of advice, counsel I got from a pastor decades ago. He said, before you try and argue against a position, make sure you understand it well enough to argue for it. And so when somebody comes and says, hey, I think the earth is flat, understand why they're making the argument they do. I just know personally, if somebody comes up and starts saying, hey, you're wrong, honestly, my immediate response, even if I might be wrong and might think I'm wrong, I'm going to fight. That's my immediate response. Mm-hmm. But if somebody comes up and says, hey, I understand what you're saying. Have you thought about this? It's like, okay, they understand me well enough. So I'm inclined to listen more to what they're saying. And now they've got me to think about, why am I believing that? Is that a well-founded belief? And if I'm going to change, you've done 90% of the work there, because now I'm starting to think about what I believe. I think that's what my pastor was saying there, is understand somebody's position well enough so that you can actually raise questions that might help them think, oh, let me go investigate that more. So it's not about having a stronger argument that you can just pound over the head and eventually they'll be beat into submission and come into the rational conclusion. No, it's engage the relationship, know the person. And ultimately, one of the things that I have become incredibly convinced of, the more I've done apologetics, is that I have run across numerous areas where I'm wondering, okay, how does Christianity interact with that? That might be a problem. And as I've dug in more and more, what I've recognized is that if God's the author of creation, and I believe that he is, and if he's the inspiration for scripture, and I believe that he is, there's no amount of probing Christianity that will ever show it to be wrong. And so I can run into things that I don't understand, that I don't know, but I don't have to be worried that somebody's going to come and show me that Christianity's wrong, because it's a very robust faith. So live in that confidence so that you can go out and engage other people's beliefs so that you can speak into their world. And then you'll have, if nothing else, you're going to have good conversations and good relationships. And ultimately, that's what God's designed us for.
That's right. Community.
Yes.
So where can people find you?
You go to reasons.org. There's a number of articles we've got posted there. You can find me there. You can also follow me on social media, RTB_official, various platforms. Those are probably the two best ways to do that.
Okay. Jeff, thank you 100 times for being here. And hopefully I can get the chance to pick your brain again at some point.
Well, I've enjoyed our conversation. Would love to come back and do it again on another topic.
Awesome. Thank you so much.